They looked like ordinary soldiers, laughing, smoking, even trading jokes in flawless English. But one night, at a lonely checkpoint somewhere in the Pacific, a single strange word broke the illusion. When the officer said it aloud, one man hesitated, just for a second. That pause exposed a secret that could have cost lives. The word wasn't a code or a password. It was a test, a trick born out of fear, desperation, and human instinct. During World War II, as the Pacific jungle swallowed soldiers whole and paranoia spread like wildfire, the line between friend and foe blurred. Japanese spies, fluent in English and disguised as Americans, slipped through defenses with chilling ease, until this one strange word stopped them cold. This is the story of how a simple phrase became a weapon sharper than any bullet, and how language itself turned into a battlefield. Before we dive in, make sure to hit like if you love discovering untold stories from history's hidden corners. Subscribe to Justice Unfolded for more real-life mysteries, spy tactics, and war secrets that shape the world you live in today. And hey, share this video with a friend who thinks words don't hold power. By the end, they just might change their mind. They said war was chaos, but after Pearl Harbor, it became something darker. Confusion wrapped in fear. The Pacific wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a labyrinth of whispers, uniforms, and shadows that spoke English just a little too perfectly. In 1942, every palm-fringed island seemed to hold a secret. American soldiers, young, sunburned, and half dreaming of home, found themselves standing guard under humid skies that never seemed to cool. They expected bullets, ambushes, the roar of aircraft. What they didn't expect were smiles, laughter, and voices that sounded unmistakably American, coming from men who weren't. It was a war fought not just with weapons, but with trust. And trust, out here, was the most fragile thing in the world. The fear began quietly, almost like rumor. "They can speak English," someone would mutter at a mess table. "Fluent." Another soldier would swear he'd seen it. Japanese infiltrators wearing stolen U.S. uniforms, walking straight into camps. Some stories were exaggerated, others terrifyingly true. Japan had spent years sending its brightest students to study abroad, in California, Hawaii, even New York, young men who had absorbed American slang, baseball jokes, and the easy rhythm of conversation. When the war began, some of them were drafted into Japan's intelligence network. Out in the jungles and along the beaches, it became almost impossible to tell who was who. A friendly wave might hide a spy. A perfect accent could mask a saboteur. Soldiers began looking for signs, any sign that someone didn't belong. A misplaced gesture, a word said a beat too late, an accent that felt off but they couldn't explain why. In that strange, feverish world, paranoia became survival. Commanders tried everything: passwords, challenge phrases, coded countersigns, but even those failed when an infiltrator had already learned the answers. So troops began turning to instinct, to the kind of knowledge no textbook could teach. They asked questions only a true American would know. Who won the World Series? What's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? How do you pronounce Worcestershire? Sometimes the questions were ridiculous, but they worked. Because the enemy could study grammar, they could memorize words. What they couldn't copy was culture, the humor, the rhythm, the tiny shared memories that come from living in a place, not reading about it. Slowly, the U.S. military discovered that language wasn't just communication, it was identity. And in a war where identity could kill, words became as deadly as bullets. And somewhere in that tense, sleepless atmosphere, among nervous guards and cigarette smoke and whispered suspicions, a single word would soon rise to legendary status. A strange, clumsy, utterly American word that would separate the real from the fake, the friend from the foe. Its sound would trip up even the most fluent imposter. Soldiers would remember it for decades, laughing about it later, though it had once been a matter of life and death. That word was La Palooa. No one knew exactly where it came from. Some said it was slang for something wild and extraordinary. Others thought it was nonsense made up by a bored sergeant. But soon, it would spread across the Pacific like a secret handshake, a word that could save a life or end one in a single breath. By 1943, the war in the Pacific had become a maze of islands and identities. To most Americans, the enemy was faceless, an empire that spoke in riddles and radio codes. But to the soldiers in the field, the enemy sometimes smiled, spoke in familiar slang, and called them buddy. It was unnerving. English, the one thing that had always felt like home, no longer guaranteed safety. Some of the men who spoke it best had learned it under palm trees in Honolulu or in classrooms in Los Angeles years before the war began. They weren't tourists. They were spies. Japan's intelligence network had spent decades preparing for moments like this. Long before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the imperial government had encouraged promising students to study abroad. They blended in easily, quiet, polite, hardworking, earning degrees in business or engineering while quietly gathering details about ports, factories, and naval routes. When war came, some of those same men returned to serve the empire as interpreters, propagandists, and infiltrators. Their English was flawless, their pronunciation near perfect. They could recite American slang, name baseball teams, even joke about movie stars. But language, it turned out, could only get them so far. Because English wasn't just a skill, it was a culture, and culture can't be memorized. American troops began to learn that difference the hard way. When you're exhausted, hungry, and scared, you notice strange details. Maybe a man says, okay, in a way that feels off. Maybe he laughs too stiffly at a joke. Or maybe, like one story goes, he freezes for a split second when someone says the word La Palooa. The idea that a single word could unmask a spy sounded absurd. But in the chaos of war, absurd things sometimes saved lives. That realization changed how both sides fought their invisible battles. Language wasn't just information anymore. It was a weapon, sharpened by instinct and trust. By the time American intelligence realized how deeply Japan's English-speaking operatives had penetrated the field, it was almost too late. Codebooks were being stolen. Radio messages were intercepted before they even reached command posts. Every island landing, every jungle patrol, carried the same quiet question. Who among us might be the enemy in disguise? In a war that depended on communication, even a conversation could be a trap. And as soldiers learned to question every accent and every friendly voice, the Pacific became not just a war zone, but a stage where truth and imitation blurred so perfectly, only one strange word might tell them apart. No one knows exactly who said it first. Maybe it was a tired sergeant somewhere in the Solomons. Maybe a radio operator trying to break the tension during a long night shift. But somewhere, amid the heat, mosquitoes, and exhaustion of 1943, a single word slipped out. Strange, funny, and entirely American. La Palooa. At first it was just slang, an old-fashioned term for something wild or extraordinary. A real humdinger, as soldiers might say. It rolled off the tongue easily for the Americans who grew up around that kind of talk. But for someone who learned English from a textbook or a university professor, La Palooa was a nightmare of twisted L's and R's. To native speakers, it was a silly word. To spies pretending to be them, it was an ambush in plain sight. The story goes that a guard at a checkpoint in the Pacific began using it as a test. He'd stop a group of men, exchange the usual passwords, then casually say La Palooa. The Americans would grin, repeat it, and move on. But one man, calm, uniform neat, accent flawless, hesitated. Just a flicker of confusion, a stumble between the L and the R. It was enough. That pause told the guard everything he needed to know. The man wasn't who he claimed to be. No report ever officially recorded that moment. There's no entry in any military log that says La Palooa stopped a spy that night. But soldiers don't always need paperwork to believe a story. They carried it through camps and across islands like folklore, told over coffee, retold in barracks, passed down with a grin and a shiver. Because whether or not it ever really happened didn't matter. What mattered was that it could have. And in a war where trust could vanish in a heartbeat, even a made-up story could feel like a shield. More than anything, the La Palooa legend revealed something profound. That the battle for truth wasn't just being fought with bullets and codes, but with the subtleties of human instinct. The real power of that word wasn't its sound. It was what it represented. The idea that you can't fake belonging. You can mimic the words, but not the soul behind them. And in a world drowning in deception, that simple truth might have been the most powerful weapon of all. The jungle was alive with sound, the buzz of insects, the distant hiss of rain hitting palm leaves, and the low murmur of soldiers trying to stay awake. It was sometime after midnight, 1944. A narrow dirt road snaked through the darkness, guarded by a handful of exhausted American sentries. They'd been told to expect movement that night, patrols returning from reconnaissance. But in the Pacific, orders and reality rarely matched. Every rustle felt like danger. Every shadow looked like death. Then, faintly, the crunch of boots. A group of soldiers emerged from the dark, uniforms soaked, faces streaked with mud. They looked American. They sounded American. "Evening, boys," one of them said casually, his voice smooth, confident, practiced. The guard at the post nodded but didn't lower his weapon. Something in the man's tone, too calm, too polished, didn't sit right. The sentry had heard rumors. Japanese spies dressed in U.S. gear, speaking English so perfectly they could walk right into camp. He remembered those stories as he studied the men in front of him. "Password?" he demanded. The leader answered without hesitation. "Correct." But the guard still hesitated. The words were right, but something wasn't. The accent, the rhythm, he couldn't explain it, only feel it. And that's when instinct kicked in. "Say," he began, almost smiling, "you fellas know what a La Palooa is?" The men exchanged quick glances. A few chuckled, tired, real laughter. "Sure," one said. "Means something big, right? Like a real whopper." But one of them froze, just for half a breath. His eyes flickered with confusion. La, what?" he stammered. The guard's grin vanished. His rifle lifted slightly. In that instant, the night went still. The hesitation, a single heartbeat's worth, was enough. The stranger wasn't one of them. No shots were fired that night, at least not according to any record. Some say the man ran, others that he was quietly taken away for questioning. The details changed with every retelling, but the story lived on. Soldiers repeated it from island to island, half as warning, half as legend. La Palooa had become more than a word. It was a symbol of intuition, of that unteachable sense that separates truth from imitation. In a war where deception was everywhere, that single syllable reminded soldiers that survival wasn't just about following orders. It was about listening to the small voice inside that says, something's not right. And as dawn broke over the jungle, that same word began its quiet journey into history. Part myth, part memory, and entirely human. By the middle of World War II, every soldier understood that battles weren't just fought with rifles or bombs. They were fought with words. Words became passwords, proof of identity, even weapons of survival. And in the Pacific, where faces and uniforms often looked the same in the blur of rain and moonlight, language was the one thing that could save you or destroy you. It started with slang, the little phrases every American used without thinking. "Catch you later?" "No sweat?" "You bet." For native speakers, they came naturally. For spies, they were landmines. The rhythm of a joke, the curve of an idiom, the quick banter between soldiers, none of it could be learned overnight. It wasn't just how you said something, but why. Guards began asking seemingly random questions at checkpoints. Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? What's your favorite team? Who won the last World Series? Knowing that a wrong answer or even a too perfect one could expose an imposter. These small improvised tests didn't just check knowledge, they checked belonging. Behind the front lines, military psychologists and linguists took note. They realized something profound. Communication carried culture, and culture, unlike grammar, couldn't be faked easily. The U.S. Army began studying regional dialects, idioms, even humor patterns, turning language into a science of detection. The smallest hesitation, the wrong inflection, could mean the difference between friend and foe. Soldiers joked about it, sure, but they also knew it worked. Because a real American didn't think about how to sound American. They just did. At the same time, the Japanese military was doing something eerily similar. Their own intelligence units trained operatives to imitate not just the words, but the emotions of Western speech, the sarcasm, the rhythm, the laughter. It was a strange mirror image of the same war, two sides trying to become the other, one through imitation, the other through intuition. The result was a war of echoes, a battle not of armies, but of identities. And yet through all of it, that silly word, La Palooa, endured. It became more than slang, more than a test. It was a reminder that even in the most brutal of wars, what truly set people apart wasn't their uniform or their accent. It was authenticity. The way someone carried a sentence, the warmth in a laugh, the unspoken rhythm of belonging. That in the end was the one thing no spy could ever steal. While the front lines thundered with gunfire, another kind of soldier fought a quieter, lonelier war, one waged with patience, empathy, and words. They were the Japanese-American linguists of the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service, the MIS. To most of the troops, they were invisible. To historians, they would later become legends. But during the war, they lived in a strange, painful contradiction, fighting for a country that didn't fully trust them. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, thousands of Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, entire families behind barbed wire accused of disloyalty without proof. Yet even as that happened, hundreds of young Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, volunteered to serve the very nation that had imprisoned their parents. They trained in secret, learning to read, write, and speak Japanese with flawless precision. Their job wasn't to shoot, but to understand, to translate intercepted messages, interrogate prisoners, and decode diaries found on the battlefield. They became the ears and voice of the Pacific Campaign. What made them extraordinary wasn't just their language skills, it was their insight. They understood the subtle layers of Japanese speech, the honorifics, the pauses, the way respect or rank slipped through tone alone. They could tell if a captured soldier came from Tokyo or Osaka, if his phrasing matched his supposed rank, if his fear was real or rehearsed. They didn't need to shout or threaten to extract information. They listened, patiently, perceptively, and in doing so, they often saved lives. One veteran later said, "We won battles not by shooting, but by listening faster than the enemy could lie." But their victories came at a personal cost. Many of them returned home to find their families still locked behind fences. They had shortened the war, decoded plans that prevented ambushes, persuaded entire Japanese units to surrender. Yet they weren't celebrated. Not yet. Their loyalty was questioned even after their service. It would take decades for America to honor what they had done. Today, military historians call them the silent heroes of the Pacific. Without them, the Allies might have stumbled blind through countless battles. Their story reminds us that language isn't just power. It's perspective. They fought not to destroy, but to understand. And in the echo of their quiet work, La Palooa and all its symbolism, trust, identity, intuition, took on a deeper meaning. Because sometimes the strongest voices in war are the ones history almost forgets to hear. While most soldiers fought in trenches and jungles, another army worked in rooms filled with wires, typewriters, and whispered urgency. These were the linguists, the codebreakers, the unseen minds behind the victories. For them, the war wasn't measured in bullets or bodies, but in syllables, pauses, and fragments of intercepted speech. Their battlefield was silence, and every hesitation could mean life or death. Across the Pacific, American intelligence began to realize that understanding the enemy required more than brute force. It required listening. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency, started recruiting anyone who could think across languages: professors, refugees, journalists, even missionaries who had once lived in Japan. Their mission was clear but impossibly delicate: break the enemy's voice before it broke you. In dusty huts near jungle airfields and secret offices from Hawaii to Australia, translators worked for endless hours, decoding Japanese radio chatter. A single word, misheard or mistranslated, could send troops into ambush or pull them back from disaster. They learned to read emotion through tone, to catch meaning in rhythm. A trembling voice might hint at retreat. A clipped one might mean orders had just changed. They became human lie detectors, guided not by technology, but by instinct, the same instinct that had birthed La Palooa. Meanwhile, the war of deception grew even sharper. Japanese propagandists broadcast fluent English messages over the radio, trying to demoralize Allied troops. The infamous Tokyo Rose taunted soldiers with music and mockery, her American accent unsettlingly smooth. For a moment, her voice could almost sound like home, until it twisted, cruel and alien. That confusion, that eerie mimicry, was precisely why the Allies trained their ears so ruthlessly. To hear what wasn't said, to find the truth buried inside imitation. By late 1944, the Codebreakers' victories began shaping the war's final outcome. Intercepted transmissions revealed troop movements, supply routes, even the timing of planned offensives. Thousands of lives were saved, not by firepower, but by perception. The linguists and interpreters had learned something every soldier would come to understand: that language is never just sound. It's motive, it's loyalty, it's human. And when you truly hear someone, beyond the accent, beyond the words, you uncover the truth they can't hide. La Palooa, once a soldier's joke in the jungle, had now become a symbol of a far larger reality. The war had proven that fluency wasn't authenticity, and that sometimes the smallest pause, the faintest slip of the tongue, could crack open the enemy's entire plan. Every war leaves behind ghosts, not just of the dead, but of the choices made in darkness. For the intelligence officers and linguists of World War II, those ghosts whispered in every intercepted message, every interrogation, every test that asked, "How far can truth be bent before it breaks?" Espionage is a strange kind of warfare. It's built on deceit, yet demands loyalty. It rewards lies told for the right cause. In the Pacific, that contradiction grew sharper than ever. American and Japanese intelligence units mirrored each other in their methods, both turning human behavior into data. They studied how people hesitated before lying, how emotion crept into tone, how fear disguised itself in politeness. To outsmart the enemy, they often had to think like one. For many, that moral line blurred fast. There were stories of interrogators who used kindness as their sharpest weapon, offering cigarettes, conversation, even empathy, until prisoners spoke freely. Others used fear, deception, and manipulation. Both sides justified their means with the same argument: if it saves lives, it's worth it. But was it? In the quiet moments after victory reports and decrypted messages, some officers began to question themselves. They had learned to see language not as connection, but as a tool, something to be twisted, extracted, weaponized. And once you turn words into weapons, what happens to truth itself? The La Palooa story began as a clever trick, a soldier's instinct that exposed a spy. But it also raised a deeper question about humanity in war. The word wasn't magic. It worked because it preyed on difference, on the tiny imperfections of a foreign tongue. It reminded everyone that even language, the bridge between people, could be turned into a gate. During those desperate years, soldiers learned to listen for betrayal in every voice, to doubt even laughter. And though that vigilance saved lives, it also left scars. Trust became a casualty. When the war finally began to tilt toward Allied victory, the intelligence officers faced a reckoning. They had built their strategies on deception and doubt, and won. But the cost was invisible, lingering long after the battles ended. They learned what every spy eventually does. That knowledge can win a war, but it rarely brings peace. In the end, the story of La Palooa wasn't just about catching spies. It was about how far humans can stretch truth before it stops being human at all. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and soldiers began the long journey home, they carried more than medals and scars. They carried stories. Some were about bravery, others about luck. But a few, like the tale of La Palooa, belonged to that strange border between truth and legend. No official report mentioned it. No commanding officer ever confirmed it. And yet, everyone seemed to know it. The word echoed through veterans' gatherings, over drinks, in campfire memories that stretched across decades. For many soldiers, La Palooa wasn't just a word, it was a feeling. It represented those tense moments when life balanced on instinct alone. When you had to decide in a breath whether the man in front of you was friend or foe. It reminded them that sometimes survival wasn't about orders or even courage. It was about perception, that quick flash of intuition that no rulebook could teach. The story took on a life of its own. Some claimed to have been there when it happened. Others swore it was just a joke that turned into myth. But the deeper truth didn't need verification. It lived in what the story meant. Because La Palooa symbolized something far greater than a single moment. It captured the human side of warfare, that need to make sense of chaos through small, meaningful things. Soldiers used stories like that to protect themselves from the weight of what they'd seen. It gave them a kind of comfort. The idea that wit, intelligence, or even humor could triumph over fear. A silly word that could save your life. In a way, La Palooa became a stand-in for hope itself. Proof that cleverness and instinct still mattered in a world that seemed ruled by machines and death. Over time, the story faded from military archives but lingered in oral history. Historians would later call it a legend of linguistic intuition. Linguists cited it in studies about wartime communication. Even modern intelligence officers still tell the story during training. Not because it's confirmed, but because it's useful. It reminds them that technology can only go so far. Human instinct still wins in the end. In the end, La Palooa became what so many war stories become, a piece of folklore shaped by truth, memory, and meaning. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. But the reason it still lives today is because it speaks to something universal. The need to know who we can trust, and the eternal human desire to believe that, somehow, we'll recognize honesty when we hear it. Decades have passed since that long, brutal war ended. The men who once crouched in foxholes whispering passwords under tropical rain are gone now. Their memories left behind in fading journals, yellowed letters, and a few stories told to grandchildren who could barely imagine a world without peace. But one lesson from that time has never faded. Language can be both a shield and a sword. In the modern world, wars aren't fought only with guns or tanks. They're fought with information, Cyber codes, misinformation, psychological warfare, all rely on words. And just like those young soldiers in the Pacific, today's intelligence officers still wrestle with the same truth. Fluency isn't authenticity. You can teach someone the right phrases, the correct grammar, even the perfect accent, but you can't teach the rhythm of belonging. You can't fake the feeling behind a word. That's what Palooa proved, that the smallest detail, a syllable or a pause, can reveal everything. Military schools today still teach the story, not as confirmed history, but as a parable. It's used to train new recruits to listen, not just hear, to pay attention to what's behind the words, the emotion, the hesitation, the tone. Because communication isn't simply about language, it's about humanity. And humanity is what the machines still can't quite replicate. In that sense, Palooa outlived the war. It's more than a wartime trick. It's a reminder of how fragile truth is and how easily it can be disguised. The soldiers who once muttered it under the breath of fear might never have guessed that decades later, their small improvised password would become a metaphor for the oldest battle of all, the one between truth and imitation. Every generation faces its own version of that war. Today, it might not be fought in jungles, but in the digital noise of the internet, in the endless stream of words that blur fact and fiction. And perhaps that's why this story still matters, because Palooa wasn't just a word that exposed spies. It was a moment that revealed something far deeper about us, our endless search for authenticity, for something real in a world built on disguise. In the end, it's not about how perfectly we can speak, but how honestly we can be.